In this video, I'm going to be looking into the importance of your hip flexor muscles regarding your overall leg development, your leg training, and then some issues that can arise with them being neglected, as they very often are. The term hip flexors refers to the muscles of the front of the upper leg that are responsible for the joint action of hip flexion. The first group of hip flexors that I'm going to go into, they're referred to as the iliopsoas, and these muscles lie deeper within the leg underneath what is visible to your eye, and the two muscles within the iliopsoas are the iliacus and the psoas major. The other muscle that is a hip flexor that I'm going to talk about in this video is the rectus femoris, and this is the muscle that I used as clickbait in the thumbnail for this video. And this is like the middle part of your quad that gives it more of that aesthetic look. Strengthening and growing these muscles will not only improve the aesthetic of your quads, but also improve the overall development of other muscle groups, and I'll show you why that's the case in this video. As I just mentioned, the motion that these hip flexor muscles are responsible for doing is hip flexion, and we'll see this as when the upper leg is being pulled towards the abdomen. You'll be able to achieve greater ranges of motion of hip flexion with a bent knee, but regardless of your knee position, the end range of an exercise where hip flexion could be a possible limiting factor is when the hips will start to rotate. Hip flexion is an essential movement within a resistance training program, as it's required for training your quads, your glutes, your hamstrings when you're doing any squatting, leg pressing, or hip hinging exercises. Although hip flexion is involved in almost every leg exercise you'll do, the hip flexors themselves, they rarely receive direct purposeful work within a training program, and this can lead to some issues that can negatively impact your training and development of your leg muscles. The most common issue that arises when the hip flexors are neglected is having tight hamstrings. And if you are someone who struggles with tight hamstrings, welcome to the party, as a shit ton of people have this issue. But what I'm about to show you is that the issue isn't necessarily with the hamstrings, but rather the hip flexors themselves. So the exercise I'm going to use as a demonstration when referring to your tight hamstrings is an RDL, as it's one of the most effective exercises to train the hamstrings, and this exercise will lengthen or stretch the hamstrings the most out of pretty much every exercise you'll do in the gym, which could be negatively impacted if the hamstrings are too tight to reach this lengthened position. As you're performing the eccentric and bringing the weight down, if you have tight hamstrings, your ability to receive the most benefit or stimulus on your hammies from this exercise will be limited, as you won't be able to lengthen them as far as you possibly could if they weren't tight. So when looking at the bottom position of an RDL, where you'll be in the most lengthened position for your hamstrings, what joint action is occurring? Hip flexion. And what muscles are responsible for getting us into hip flexion? Your hip flexors. So a way to test the range of motion you can perform in an RDL is to do it without any weight first, and then actively use your hip flexors to pull you as deep into hip flexion as you can, and this is known as your active range of motion. If the hip flexors are weak, they will just suck at bringing you into a deep range of hip flexion, and your active range of motion will be relatively small. If those muscles are too weak, your ability to get deep into hip flexion will be limited, as the response from your hamstrings is sending you a signal that they are too tight to get deeper into hip flexion. But what many don't realize is that the issue of these tight hammies is actually a response to the hip flexors being too weak. So the result of this is you just simply won't be able to reach the desired hip flexion needed to reach the bottom position you'd want to get to during an RDL to train the hamstrings in their lengthened position. So now, once weight is added to the exercise, the range of motion you'll be able to perform while keeping the tension on your hamstrings is known as your loaded range of motion, and you should be relatively close to the same range of motion as your active range of motion. It will likely be a little bit smaller, but definitely not bigger. It may seem easier for you to go deeper with added weight as it's pulling you down, but if you can't reach a certain degree of hip flexion with only your body weight as the resistance, you certainly won't be able to increase the range of motion while maintaining tension on your hamstrings if you make the exercise harder by just holding on to weight in your hands. So recapping issue number 1 is that tight hamstrings are often caused by weak hip flexors, and your range of motion during an exercise like the RDL will be limited because the hamstrings won't hold the tension in a range of motion where the hip flexors are just simply too weak to bring you into. Besides having weak hip flexors, another issue many deal with regarding their hip flexors could be them being tight themselves. So a common sign that someone may have tight hip flexors is when their lower back is excessively arching. Oftentimes, a tight muscle is an indirect sign for the issue happening somewhere else. There are many reasons as to why someone may have an excessive arch in their lower back when they're doing lower body exercises, but one of the more common reasons is because the abs aren't properly engaged. So in this video demonstration, you can see here my starting position where I have a relaxed abdomen and my lower back is what I would consider excessively arched if I was going to do a leg exercise. If I contract my abs to create the brace I would need to perform any lower body exercises, you can see that the excessive arch goes away. If we can brace the abs properly, this will allow the hip flexors to relax, as they may have been trying to overcompensate for the lack of stability because your abs weren't properly engaged. So the best way to address the issue of having either weak or tight hip flexors is just to simply train them. Keeping a braced core to prevent excessive rounding in the lower back is crucial for those of you who have the tight hip flexor issue, but it's also important for creating the stability to gain strength in the hip flexors as you train them if the weak hip flexors are your issue. One exercise that almost everyone has access to that trains the rectus femoris is the leg extension, particularly in the shortened position as you're contracting them. When you're doing a leg extension, make sure that you're spending time holding the squeeze, and you want to make sure that the rectus femoris is contracting hard. And then a good activation cue is to think about pulling your kneecap up towards your hip as you reach that squeezed position. Another exercise that's good if you have access to a machine like this is this hip machine that I'm using in this video, and this is good for training all of your hip flexors. And big cue again is to make sure that you're keeping your core braced throughout. And then if you don't have access to a machine like that, you can simply do just hanging leg raises. They're often used to train your abs, but a way to bias more of your hip flexors is to just hold your braced ab position and just work on raising your legs. If you found this video helpful in addressing either your tight or weak hip flexor issues you may be having in the gym, like, share, subscribe to this video. If you see someone in the gym who also might have this issue that you think would be able to take some criticism without getting pissed, send them this video as well so you can help them improve their training. If you're interested in anything else I have made in the name of just getting you fucking yacked, you can head to my website at evolutionaryaesthetics.com. On there, I've got some workout programs that you can follow. You can sign up for my weekly newsletter that gives you updates for these workout programs. And then I've got a Potent Predators ebook, which just gives you as much information as I could think of to help you reach your physique goals as fast as possible, but also doing it in a way that improves your quality of life outside of the gym. Leave a comment below if there's something else you'd want me to cover, and we'll see each other in the next video.